Very nice. Kids, you can be dismissed to kids' church. We have kids' church for ages 1 to 11, and it's their chance to learn about God's love on their own level. So many of you know that I was involved with Chi Alpha Campus Ministries when I was a student. And it was a life-changing time for me. I was making just real quality friendships that I felt like I had never had. Just the depth of friendship where people really deeply cared about my life. And I was learning to care about other people's lives. We had small group Bible study every week. We had my small group leader, Joyce, met with me every week. We had a worship service on campus every week. And so I was just seeing my friends and my community and learning about God every week. And then I went home for the summer. And I was then lacking my friendships and the times that I was really learning and growing in my relationship with God. And I was feeling lonely and distant from God. And I started feeling like I wasn't sure anymore. Like, was I making it all up? Was this just something that had meant something to me, but then when the rubber really meets the road, like it's not really true anymore? And so I remember this one particular time where I was trying to pray and I was struggling to figure out if this God thing was really real. And I started trying to ask God, like, well, is this real? Are you real? And I wasn't really sure. What I thought I wanted was like some assurance of the facts, that like maybe this voice from heaven would suddenly speak and be like, Julie, this is the right way that you are supposed to go, and Jesus is real, and you're supposed to follow this way. But that didn't happen in that moment. I'll share with you what did happen in that moment in a little bit. We have been in our First Kings series, and First Kings is one of the books where Israel and Judah have numerous kings over time, and it's the story of God interacting with them and in the midst of the kings and what the Israelites are doing and what the kings are doing. And we get to learn a lot about interacting when there's lots of ideologies and political things and whatever trying to get our attention. And it's a book that reminds us that only God is the ultimate truth and ultimate answer. So I've been having fun so far. We've opened up the book with chapter 1, and Solomon is anointed king by David. And then last week we did chapter 2, and it was Solomon's first acts as king. If you were here, you might remember that David had 2 dying wishes. One was that Solomon would follow the ways of the Lord, and the second was some avenging of some enemies. And last week we saw Solomon doing the second one. And he started off his reign of his kingdom by avenging enemies. And now we are going to pick up in chapter 3. Last week we had talked about how maybe that was part of the system of that culture to avenge your enemies when you first become king. But if that's really not what God's loving kingdom is like, then maybe there are ways that we need to question the systems around us, even if every other person has done it. So this week we're in chapter 3, and it starts out like this. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David. The people were sacrificing at the high places. Because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. So we start off, and we learned last week that Adonijah was pursuing Abishag in marriage, and it was a political move. And you notice here that, again, we have another political move in marriage. And in this case, it's not so great. We have Solomon making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. So this book is written in the context of the oral tradition of Israel. And when Israel is going to be thinking about Pharaoh, they're going to be thinking about their time of enslavement under Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And so the readers of this are going to be like, a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. This might not be very good. And so we're seeing kind of the greater narrative of the book. You know, sometimes when we read scripture, we're kind of looking for that one verse that really sticks out to us. But it's important to think about the whole arc of a book. And the whole arc of 1 Kings is a story about Israel. And so we start out with David, and then Solomon is crowned king, and then Solomon makes his first move. And we see these little tidbits that are crafting our story. There's some like, ooh, that sounds good moments, and some, oh, uh-oh moments, just like when you're reading a novel, right? You know, you start reading, and there's some good things that happen, and then there's some bad things that happen, and that's it. You know, so it just makes you curious, like, oh, what's going to happen next? What does ultimately happen for Solomon? So he has made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh and marries Pharaoh's daughter. And people are sacrificing at high places. At this time, the high places were associated with being close to God. So they figure like God's up there in the sky somewhere. You know, we still kind of have that sort of belief that God's like up somehow. And so they would go to the highest elevation they could to worship God, whether that was God, Jehovah, the Lord Almighty, or whether it was other kinds of gods. People would go to the high places to worship. So they're worshiping Yahweh, but there's other people who are worshiping other kinds of gods also at high places. So verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. So here's another like, oh, maybe that's a good part of the story, right? So we have Solomon, it says he loved the Lord, and he's walking in the statutes of David his father. So then as we read the story, we're wondering like, oh, okay, like David's 2 dying wishes, he did the second one. Maybe he's going to do the first. Let's find out. So the first verse 3 here is a little bit confusing, and even in the translations it's a little bit confusing because it seemed to be saying he loved the Lord, yet he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. So it's hard to know whether he's making offerings to God Almighty or if he's making offerings to other gods. But either way, he went to Gibeon, and this was a place, one of the high places, to sacrifice there. It was a very great high place, so that was where he's going to do some sacrificing. In verse 5, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." So I'm not actually sure whether Solomon went up to the high place to worship God Almighty or whether he was worshiping a different God. But either way, God decides to appear to him in a dream. Apparently he fell asleep while worshiping on the high place. I don't know what the traditions were. Maybe they spent the night there. And God asks him, ask what I shall give you. Did I write that down right? Anyway, he's asking Solomon, what do you want? If God asked you, what do you want? What would you ask him? I'm going to skip a few verses here, but Solomon and God have this conversation. And Solomon talks about how God's steadfast love has been with him, and steadfast love to David, and how big Israel had gotten. And so in verse 9, Solomon makes his request. So God has asked him, ask whatever you want, and here's what Solomon asks for. He says, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind and hearing heart to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? So of all the things that Solomon could have asked for, he decided to ask for an understanding mind and hearing heart. As I was thinking about this, it made me realize that, I get into the lens of being an American, and in the American political system, we have the three branches of government, right? The legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And so, but in this land, the king is everything. The king makes the laws, and then they're the executive, and they're the chief judge. And so Solomon is thinking like, okay, well, while I'm king, I need to be able to be a really good judge. And so we're going to find out that the first case is brought to him, and we're going to find out what happens. But he's thinking, I'm going to need an understanding mind and hearing heart in order to be a judge over the people. So I'm going to skip a few verses too here, but God is pleased with Solomon's request and says that since he didn't ask for riches or a long life, he'd give Solomon those too. So apparently God was kind of expecting him to ask for lots of money and ask for a longer life, but Solomon decided to ask for wisdom. So now we see Solomon's wisdom getting put to the test. So here is his first court case as king. Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house, only we 2 were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born." So I don't know if you're tracking the story. We got 2 women, and both of them had babies, and one of the babies died. The mother of the dead baby switches the babies so that she could have a living baby, and the other woman would have her dead baby. But the other woman said, "No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours." The first said, "No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine." Thus they spoke before the king. So here's Solomon, and here's his first court case, and he needs to decide whose child this baby is. And both women are saying that the dead one is not theirs and the live one is theirs. Then the king said, the one says, "This is my son that is alive and your son is dead." And the other says, "No, but your son is dead and my son is the living one." And the king said, "Bring me a sword." oh, what's going to happen here? So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, "Divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other." So here's his solution. This is Solomon. And he is saying, let's break the baby in two and give half to each. That'd be fair, right? Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him." Then the king answered and said, "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." So Solomon makes a move that is considered to be very wise. He threatens the death of the child, and he is perceiving that the woman whose child it really is will care that the child is going to die and would be willing to give the child away so that the child can live. And so this is how Solomon discerns whose child this should be. And so the people are like, I don't remember. Oh, yes. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So it's kind of a wild story. Wouldn't happen in our court system. But, I mean, it does show a lot of discernment of the king and realizing that if he were to threaten the death of the child, that the right mother would show up. And so Solomon is being celebrated. Solomon has asked God for wisdom. He was asked, whatever you want, I'm going to give you. And Solomon asks for wisdom. And here is God's wisdom on display through Solomon. And people are like, wow, this is incredible. We haven't seen this kind of wisdom. I won't read a lot of 1 Kings 4, but it continues to celebrate this glorious season of the king. So as we've seen, as I said, we're starting this story. We're starting this story, and we have those uh-oh moments of Solomon deciding to marry Pharaoh's daughter. And we have the uh-oh moments of him deciding to execute a bunch of people at the beginning of his reign. But then we also see these glorious moments of wow, this is incredible. Solomon is saying he's following the Lord, and Solomon asked for wisdom, and Solomon decided a great case here. And so Solomon is establishing officials in the kingdom. He establishes priests and secretaries, recorders, army commanders, officers. You can read them if you want. Lots of crazy names to try to wade through. There's a person in charge of the palace. There's a person in charge of forced labor. There's 12 tax officials over the 12 tribes of Israel. And wealth abounds. There's flour, there's oxen, there's cattle, there's sheep, there's fowl, there's vines, there's fig trees, there's barley, and wisdom abounds. And Solomon writes proverbs and songs about trees and beasts and birds and reptiles and fish. Chapter 4 is just going on and on and on about the wisdom and the wealth and the organization. And what's helpful to remember here is that the Israelites are only 2 generations from a very simple subsistence economy. And so David as king did a little bit more organization of the country as king, but Solomon is taking it to another level to have all these different officials, the priests, the secretaries, the recorders, the army commanders, the officers. But we have a couple more of those little uh-oh moments here because we have a person in charge of forced labor. And again, the Israelites are not very far away from their enslavement in Egypt. they were forced labor and they didn't like it. And yet here we are, them deciding to have forced labor as well. And we have the 12 tax officials, and having the organization of taxation is, fine. But we see with all the wealth, all this wealth that's coming into the kingdom, like, yes, hopefully that means that the people are provided for, but it's clear that Solomon's kingdom is also very, 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 very well provided for, which means he's collecting lots and lots and lots of taxes from the people. So anything that the kingdom is getting, all the flour and the oxen and the cattle and the sheep and the fowl and the vine and the fig tree and the barley, is all coming from the people. And so it's another one of those little uh-oh moments in this story of Israel, of whether or not this is going to be a good thing for Israel to have extreme taxes so that the government can look like it's flourishing. So we sense a possible tipping point. When I'm reading a novel and I'm going along, there might be a couple uh-oh moments, but the story is like getting good, like, wow, there's so many good things happening in the story. And then you start wondering, like, when are things going to go wrong? And I think that's where we are. However, in this moment, Solomon is doing quite a few things right. He's organizing the government. He was given the opportunity to ask God for anything, and he decides to ask for wisdom. Also a really positive thing. So we come back to that question. If you could ask God for anything, what would you ask for? In my crisis of faith, when I was sitting in my bedroom after coming home from college, I really wanted answers. I wanted that voice from heaven to say, you're doing the right thing, or like, Jesus is real, or whatever. And I wonder what would have happened if that would have been the case. If I would have received that. I think I actually would have come back around that mountain another time in my life and had another crisis of faith where I needed God to speak to me and I didn't really believe the other previous voice. But what ended up happening is that as I was praying, I was looking for answers, but for some reason, God decided to give me wisdom instead. And the wisdom I received or thought of or whatever was that I realized that even if it was all false, even if Jesus wasn't king, even if God wasn't real, I would still want to live my life like Jesus said to do. I would still want to live in a way where the best leader is the best servant, where to get up, you got to go down, where kindness, where mercy, where grace, where love is abound. I would want to live in the understanding that I am loved. And so God answered that prayer in a neat way that I would have never expected. I wanted that voice from heaven to tell me everything was right. But instead, I got wisdom. And that has stuck with me over decades. I still remember coming to that moment in my faith that I was like, okay, even if it's all wrong, I still would want to live this way. When I went to Thailand on a mission trip, we traveled down to the southern part of Thailand. And one day we got lunch from kind of a street vendor. And I was so hungry. We were doing this kids camp. The tsunami had just happened recently in Thailand. And so we were doing this kids camp for tsunami orphans. I wish I would have actually known Thai so I could understand what the kids were saying, but we were trying to participate and serve. And so I was so hungry, and we got this lunch from the vendor, and I got this little box, one of those like takeout kind of boxes. And I am opening up the box, and I'm hoping that it's just like this incredible food, right? I'm so hungry. And I open it up, and it's like a spoon of rice and like 3 tiny strips of chicken. And I almost cried because I ate it. It was okay, but it was not what I was hoping for. And I was still hungry afterwards. But when I got back to Bangkok, our team finished our tour through southern Thailand. We got back to Bangkok and we had kind of a free day. And some of us, my teammates and I, decided to go to this restaurant. And this restaurant was so amazing. It had so many, like, it was a buffet style for the salad bar, but the salad bar was like the best salad bar you could ever ask for. They had fruit and all the salad fixings you could possibly imagine. And so I just go to the salad bar, my plate is like filled up with fruit, and I order this dinner that's this huge chunk of chicken, which at that time of my life was very important because I grew up in a very meat and potatoes kind of family where you needed a big hunk of meat for your dinner. And so I sat down, and I also almost cried at this dinner because I had not felt like I had gotten enough food, which is another story that was mostly my fault. Through the rest of the trip. And so sitting down to dinner, it was like this 3-course meal. I think there are times in our lives where God asks us, maybe he asks us every day, like, what would you want from me? And we ask these prayers that are like asking for a grain of rice, when it would be possible to ask God for a 3-course meal. And Solomon decides to ask for the 3-course meal. There are answers, there are little answers that we ask for, and they're not bad. I'm not saying like change your whole prayer life. But I wonder what it would be like if we asked more often for greater things in our prayers. We ask God for wisdom, for an understanding heart, and better understanding. You can call Nate back. So what would that look like for you? You know, what are your prayers currently like? Are they more equivalent to asking for grains of rice? Or are they more equivalent to asking for a 3-course meal? Wisdom from God to help us. I know I have many areas in my life where I don't actually need just like little answers. I need greater wisdom to really satisfy my soul and really help me in that situation. So when Nate comes back, he's going to just play on the guitar for a little bit. And I want to invite you to either just pray in your own mind, asking God for wisdom for something in your life. But I want to invite you, if you're open to it, to find someone to pray with and share with them, you know, something that you are needing wisdom for in your life. And you can exchange that and then pray for one another. So Nate's going to pray, or play, not pray. You can pray if you want. And we'll just have a little time where we're seeking God, asking for his wisdom. And I invite you to find someone to pray with if you're open to that. And then we'll close with a final song.